On the eastern border of the Byzantine Empire, unusual newcomers appeared. They were strangely dressed and spoke an incomprehensible language. No one knew where they came from or why they had arrived. The Byzantines called these newcomers Otsagano. This name was adopted by their neighbors, and it has come down to us as gypsies. 1,000 years have passed since then, but the gypsies remain a mysterious people. They are insular and reluctant to open up to the outside world. Back then, and even now, most live so far below the poverty line that it's terrifying to imagine. But today, we will look at this people from a different angle, through the lens of history and politics. We will discuss why the gypsy people live the way they do and why they still have no state of their own. The answer, as you'll understand by the end, is far from simple. But before we dive into this topic, a small disclaimer. Something tells me that some of you may have had negative experiences related to gypsies or people you thought resembled them. Personal experience is incredibly important. Still, I'm not here to convince you that anyone is good or bad. This video is about something else. Today, the gypsies are the most prominent example of a people not only without a state, but even without autonomy. Gypsies struggle to find official employment, access education, or receive medical care. These problems, like the gypsies themselves, transcend the borders of any country. Life is tough for gypsies almost everywhere, and they are often followed by news of crime. Some believe that all these issues could be resolved if they had their own state. But why, over their 1,000-year history in Europe, has this never happened? Why do the gypsies have neither a homeland, nor a nation, nor unity? And what, after all, unites this people who remain scattered across countries? Let's dive in. You're on a channel where interesting stories are not just told, but also explained. After arriving in Byzantium, the gypsies lingered in southern Europe, in regions near Greece. In the 10th century, they were on Crete, in Serbia, Croatia, and other Balkan countries. The further time went on, the deeper they moved westward. No one back then knew who the gypsies were or where they were headed. Moreover, there are still no written records of the gypsy people's history before their arrival in Europe. We know almost nothing about why they appeared on the Byzantine border. But we do know where they came from. And for that, we must thank not historians, but linguists. In the 16th century, in the Netherlands, at Leiden University, a student named Istvan overheard a conversation among 3 students from India. They were casually chatting in their native language. Istvan noticed that their dialect was somewhat similar to the gypsy speech he had heard from workers on his family estate. He approached the students and wrote down some of their words. Later, it turned out that Dutch gypsies understood many of these words without any trouble. And then it clicked for him. If the gypsies spoke an Indian language, they must have originated somewhere in India. The Indian origin of the gypsies has been confirmed by modern linguistic and genetic research and remains the mainstream theory in Romani studies. But it all began in the Middle Ages. In the early 14th century, an Irish monk visited the eastern Mediterranean and described the local Indians who had much in common with ravens and coal, likely a reference to their dark skin. A century later, the German cartographer Sebastian Münster wrote that the homeland of German gypsies lay in Asia, along the Ganges or Indus rivers. These people clearly had some inklings, but the knowledge quickly faded. You have to understand that for medieval Europeans, the word India meant nothing. And as a state, India didn't exist until British colonization. Popular rumor even claimed that gypsies had flown in from the moon or come from Atlantis. In short, it was a free flight of fantasy tinged with xenophobia. Even today, there's no scientific consensus. Some researchers believe the gypsies were a warrior caste from northern India. We recently released a video about India's caste system. Check it out if you haven't seen it. Supposedly, when the Muslim commander Mahmud of Ghazni invaded India in the early 11th century, gypsy forces fought against the invaders. Their defense failed, and they fled through the mountains to Persia. Over time, the gypsies moved further and further west until they finally reached Europe in the Middle Ages. Another version suggests that in India, the gypsies were a lower caste, perhaps because unsanitary conditions are often found in gypsy camps today. Some are convinced that the Gypsies' ancestors in India were artisans or even performers, which would explain the traditional occupations of their European descendants: fortune-telling, dancing, singing, and snake charming. Honestly, we're unlikely to ever know who the Gypsies were or what they were fleeing from. Asking the Gypsies themselves about their origins is also somewhat pointless. They have no remaining ties to their ancient homeland. They know no more than the scholars do. When you're constantly moving from place to place, it's obvious that preserving historical memory becomes a challenge. Every time it began to rise, like dough, the Gypsies would pack up and move on. And with them went their camps and the memory of their last stop. The Gypsies never recorded stories of their wanderings. Their travels make for great material for ancient and colorful tales, but not for a coherent history of the people. From a scientific perspective, historical memory is something that forms in settled societies, people who live on the same land generation after generation and take an interest in who lived there before them. Such societies usually develop things like writing and statehood, which lead to abundant archival records. The Gypsies had no archives. They weren't concerned with preserving memory. Their history is one-sided, always told through the voices of those who came into contact with them, usually police, the Inquisition, or other authorities that people generally try to avoid. What was Gypsy life like when they weren't caught in the state's crosshairs? We can only guess. In every sense, the Gypsies have no homeland, and thus no primary source of national identity. A homeland is a cornerstone, a tool for consolidating a nation. It's much more than just a piece of land. Its greatest value is spiritual and psychological. Those fortunate enough to have nation-states can say, things here are different from everywhere else. Things work the way we like them, and no one can tell us how to live. Spiritually, a homeland is a refuge, an inexhaustible political resource. A homeland is, above all, an idea, a collective unconscious. History provides examples of peoples preserving the sense of a homeland even when its physical borders are lost. The most obvious example is right in front of us. For 19 centuries, the Jewish people, through their wanderings, preserved the idea of the Jerusalem Temple, their main spiritual center. This was passed down from generation to generation through rituals and traditions. Synagogues were synagogues, but everyone knew where the true temple was. No one had seen it since the 1st century CE, yet legends were enough. The key point here is that these legends existed. They were carefully passed down through generations. But the Gypsies had no such home. They had something else, though. Each Gypsy community typically lives its own life, separate from its neighbors. Gypsies call themselves Roma, but not all do. As a name for the entire ethnic group, Roma is used only in political or academic contexts. Strictly speaking, there is no such people as the Gypsies. Not only are there Christian Gypsies and Muslim Gypsies, with a vast divide between them, but Gypsies also differ significantly within a single country. For example, in Romania's Transylvania, there are Hungarian Roma, or Romungri, whose language is heavily influenced by Hungarian. Then there are Wallachian Roma, or Vlaxica Roma, who speak a dialect close to Romanian. For context, the distance between them is only 100 to 200 kilometers. In Russia, there's a whole array of Gypsy ethnic groups. The largest are the Russian Roma, but there are also Calderash, Kalyeri, Ticinets, Serbs, Vlachs, Crimean, and Moldavian Gypsies. Each group has its own traditions, often its own dialects. They live separately, rarely interacting. Moreover, and this is crucial, not all Gypsies lead a nomadic lifestyle. Many are fully settled citizens of European states, especially in Western Europe. They're as far removed from fortune-telling as Russians are from pagan rituals. In short, a unified Gypsy culture is impossible to find, even with a magnifying glass. Some Gypsies may even consider others not real Gypsies. One way to exclude someone from being a Gypsy is through Romanype. This is something like a folk Gypsy philosophy, the quintessence of the Gypsy spirit. Roughly speaking, Romanype is Gypsiness. If you lack it, even if you're ethnically Gypsy 100 times over, you'll be an outsider in the community. What distinguishes a gypsy from a non-gypsy is primarily loyalty to gypsy traditions. This includes, in particular, a life of constant movement. Another cornerstone of gypsy thinking is the division of the world into us and them, Roma and Gajo. Gajo are non-gypsies, foreigners, outsiders. This divide has been one of the reasons for the alienation of Roma communities from the outside world. Non-gypsies and non-gypsy cultures are, by definition, seen as a threat. Contact with the outside world is strictly controlled. Spending too much time with a Gajo comes at a cost. In the gypsy language, words like man, boy, woman, and girl differ depending on whether they refer to a gypsy or a non-gypsy. Many gypsies would never sit at the same table with a Gajo. Some even distinguish between gypsy and non-gypsy illnesses or curses. In other words, it's not ethnicity, but lifestyle that defines gypsy identity. You might think Romanipe could be the unifying element, a ready foundation for building a nation. But no, the contradictions are too great. The lack of a homeland and their fragmentation prevent gypsies from uniting. But these are minor issues compared to the challenges they faced in medieval Europe. It's the early 15th century. The gypsies have arrived in German lands. A chronicle from the Bavarian city of Augsburg notes, the gypsy procession was led by 2 dukes, and the group consisted of 50 men accompanied by women and children. They had dark skin. They were skilled in fortune-telling and presented themselves as exiles from Little Egypt. By the 15th century, Europeans had finally figured out who the gypsies were, or so they thought. They were Egyptians. Hence the semi-derogatory English term, gypsy, from Egypt. The gypsies themselves didn't mind this version. Being Egyptian sounded interesting, exotic, like something out of a fairy tale. Being called a Turk was far more offensive. Why did the gypsies pick such a bad time to relocate to Europe? 600 years ago, the Christian world was under attack by Ottoman sultans. For European Christians, the Turks were an existential threat, conquering one Christian kingdom after another. In the same 15th century, the Ottoman Empire swallowed the only European city with 1 million inhabitants, Constantinople. At the same time, news spread of Mongol hordes and the Muslim Moors oppressing Spain. The Christian world felt surrounded by enemies, so the gypsies, who looked vaguely southeastern, were seen as part of this global threat purely based on their appearance, and persecution began. Medieval legal systems showed remarkable efficiency. Anti-gypsy laws typically appeared just a few years after gypsies arrived in new lands. Amid anti-Muslim panic, gypsies were given new names and labels. Some called them Saracens, others Tatars, but the Egyptian version stuck best. Of course, the hysteria couldn't last forever, nor could the Ottoman Empire's expansion. Europeans soon realized that the gypsies weren't agents of the Turkish Sultan and had no intention of converting anyone to their faith. With difficulty, the gypsies began to settle in new places. Their foreignness wasn't an issue if they could provide unique services. They weren't allowed inside city gates, but they could stay on the outskirts. Gypsies proved to be skilled artisans. A mutually beneficial barter system quickly emerged. Gypsies lived in tight-knit groups, organizing something akin to cooperatives. Eastern European gypsies had their own specialties: blacksmithing, jewelry making, and horse trading. By the end of the Middle Ages, gypsies had settled across nearly all of Europe, but irritation grew alongside their presence. At first, people were annoyed by beggars, but anti-gypsy sentiment wasn't yet systemic. Discrimination was limited to individual cities. The gypsies, taught by bitter experience, created a collective legend. During their travels across Europe, they often claimed to be pilgrims heading to a holy site. This usually worked. Christian Europe was full of holy places, and pilgrimage was the most popular reason for medieval travel, aside from war or markets. The legend worked the first time gypsies appeared in a city, and often the second time too. But when it became clear that these dark-skinned folks weren't worshipping relics, but simply wandering back and forth, attitudes toward them soured. To make matters worse, after 1500, Europe's religious climate began to change rapidly. The once unified Catholic world split in two within a few decades. 50 years after Martin Luther published his 95 Theses, nearly 40% of Europeans considered themselves Protestants. For the Gypsies, the Reformation was bad news. What kind of pilgrimage could there be when all holy sites belonged to the Pope, whom Protestants despised? Their legend began to fall apart. Begging became harder too. While the Catholic Church viewed poverty calmly, even as a virtue, pragmatic Protestants saw it as a vice. The protection of Christian faith evaporated. Xenophobia reached historic highs. Gypsies not only looked provocative, but also practiced strange, foreign rituals. Settled communities have always viewed nomads with suspicion. Anyone who's flown on a plane knows that sitting by the aisle gives you more legroom, but you constantly have to get up because your neighbors need to go somewhere. Now imagine you're not on a plane for 3 to 4 hours, but in your own home, with constant movement around you, unfamiliar people, a revolving door, and the concept of tolerance for foreign cultures? Even today, this sparks hatred in some, and in the Middle Ages, it wasn't even up for discussion. Fear of outsiders in the Middle Ages served as a social regulator. A person without prejudice or social protection wouldn't last long. They had to belong to a community, a village, a guild, or ideally, a noble family. In a world where your life and status depended on connections, free-spirited outsiders were doomed to robbery, murder, or exile. Gypsies often didn't even fit into the local church system. Tradition dictated that parishes should support their poor, but beggars and vagrants were denied church charity. They were to be driven out, back to wherever they came from. The problem was, Gypsies had no priests of their own, nor native lands to return to. With nowhere to go, they were trapped in a cycle of poverty. Poverty bred more poverty, turning their communities into social ghettos. Soon, crime became an inevitable trait. Camps gained a reputation as criminal enclaves, and often, this was true. Traditional trades brought from India gave way to crime. Reselling and craftsmanship turned into theft, including horse theft. This only reinforced prejudices. Private discrimination became structural. An entire people became a collective persona non grata. For the next 200 years, until the mid-16th century, European states viewed gypsies as criminals by definition. In the 15th century, England banned gypsies from entering. The law stated that anyone over 14 years old identified as a vagrant was to be brutally whipped and branded through the cartilage of the right ear with a red-hot iron about an inch in size. Gypsies were literally branded, as if they weren't human but livestock. Branding could be avoided if a local took them into service for a year. Not only gypsies, but anyone associated with them faced punishment. The active phase of persecution lasted a century and a half. In England, gypsies were hanged as late as the mid-15th century. In German lands, anti-gypsy pogroms raged until the Enlightenment. In the Netherlands, gypsies were hunted like animals, though you won't see that in Vermeer's paintings. The French weren't exactly humane either. King Louis XIV, the Sun King, regretted that his predecessors hadn't expelled gypsies from France and tried to make up for it. Gypsy men were sent to the galleys for life. Minor boys were sent to poorhouses. Gypsy women had their heads shaved. If they continued vagrancy, they were whipped and expelled without trial. The worst was in the Balkans. In Romania, being a gypsy meant being a slave. It's hard to say when this began, but by the late 15th century, it was the societal norm. Monasteries typically used this free labor, and aristocrat boyars didn't pass up the opportunity either. Profitable gypsy slavery was exported, with slaves often sent across the ocean to European colonies in America, where labor was always needed. Today, many gypsies in the New World are descendants of plantation slaves, just like African Americans, except they arrived even earlier. The first gypsy slaves reached the West Indies on Columbus's ships, 100 years before the first African slaves. One theory suggests that gypsy enslavement was tied to the Crusades. The regular conscription of men to the Middle East caused labor shortages in southern Europe, and the vulnerable, rootless gypsies filled the gap. Over time, this practice turned into full-fledged slavery, lasting in modern-day Romania as long as serfdom did in Russia. In short, if you were a gypsy in Europe, life would be miserable. And where could your family go? In Eastern Europe, you'd be enslaved by boyars. If you made it to Northern or Western Europe, you'd be accused of spying for the Turks or heresy, both leading to a broken neck and asphyxiation. So, the logical question, if anti-gypsy laws were so harsh, how did they survive? There was always room to maneuver. Some locals ignored the bans, finding it more profitable to trade with gypsies than fight them. Corrupt officials were also a last resort for the persecuted. And finally, medieval law enforcement, if you can even call it that, was inefficient. The modern police system is a product of centralized states, but the feudal patchwork of medieval Europe was no place for effective cops or bureaucrats. Gypsies took advantage of this. Anti-gypsy laws existed in almost every European country, and they were brutally harsh. While they failed to expel or exterminate the gypsies, the repression worked. No gypsy self-organization could emerge. The 15th century didn't change this fundamentally. Europeans invented remarkable forms of state and societal organization. Many spoke out about the plight of peasants and the immorality of monarchies, but no one cared about the marginalized. The light of humanism didn't reach gypsy camps. Gypsies, as vagrants, were still seen as criminals. They were forcibly tied to the land, and their children were taken for re-education. In the 19th century, the era of scientific racism began, when racial hatred was considered not hatred, but a scientifically justified stance. Naturally, when skulls were measured, the gypsy skull didn't pass muster. The founder of criminology, Cesare Lombroso, called gypsies physiological deviants who were born criminals, not made. This pathologization of gypsies, ascribing them innate depravity, was later adopted by the Nazis of the Third Reich. In the 19th century, Europe was gripped by a fever of nationalism, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. German lands, the Habsburg, Romanov, and Ottoman empires were crumbling. European nations emerged as if from nowhere, staking claims to power. The birth of each nation, Polish, Serbian, American, is unique, but some common trends can be identified, or we won't understand why the concept of a gypsy nation never materialized. Take one of the most popular frameworks. Czech historian Miroslav Rock outlines 3 stages of national movements. According to Rock, it starts with culture and literature. The most active and educated part of society lays the foundation for identity, drawing attention to unifying cultural elements, legends of ancient heroes, folklore, and a literary language. At this stage, there are no demands on the authorities, much like in our video about children's fairy tales that sparked World War I. The next stage is political. Activists begin advocating for cultural and political rights, making demands of the government. Finally, in the third stage, the national movement seeking a state becomes widespread. For many European nations, these stages took decades. Opportunities often arose during major wars. Here's the crux of our story. This framework applies not only to large, settled peoples. Take the Sami of the far Arctic. Like gypsies, the Sami are nomads, but native to Europe, living where almost no one else does. State borders meant little to them, but today they must be acknowledged. The Sami are a minority even in Finnish Lapland, where they're most numerous. Their neighbors treated them less harshly than gypsies, but in a similar vein. Common methods included deportation and integration. Until World War II, efforts were made to stop the Sami from being Sami. They had no standard language, and most were illiterate until the 20th century. Yet, their national movement emerged on schedule in the 19th century alongside most European peoples. Educated Sami attended universities, published books, and created cultural clubs. Then they entered politics. A full state was never seriously considered. Cultural autonomy was the ultimate goal. And they succeeded. Norway now has a Sami parliament with limited powers to address internal community matters. Finland's Sami have their own parliament too. Another example, less northern. Ask any Hungarian friends you might have how they ended up on the Pannonian Plain. They'll tell you, The finding of the homeland. Hungarians are a Finno-Ugric people, their closest relatives not Finns or Karelians, but the Conti and Mansi. It's nearly 5,000 kilometers from Budapest to Kani-Manziesk. Hungarians arrived in Europe in the 10th century after centuries of migration from the Urals. They were outsiders in Europe, yet they became an integral part of it. For nearly 1,000 years, they've been devout Catholics and as enlightened as their neighbors and former compatriots, the Austrians. Neither the lack of a homeland nor a nomadic lifestyle is a death sentence for a people striving for national self-determination and statehood. But back to the Gypsies. While young European nations fought century-old monarchies for nation-states, Gypsies languished without a hint of civic identity. In the 19th century, and even today, most Gypsies lived in Eastern and Southern Europe, but empires Russian and Ottoman typically crushed any political initiative from their subjects. Since the 10th century, Gypsies in Romania lived in brutal slavery. Romani scholar David Crow called this a state of social death. A Gypsy simply didn't exist in society. Their entire identity was reduced to negation. A Gypsy was someone who wasn't a Romanian peasant. I've already mentioned that the Gypsy question was never raised in the fight for civil rights. Enlightenment was enlightenment, liberalism was liberalism, but anti-Gypsy sentiment followed its own schedule. Romania was no exception. While serfdom was abolished there in the mid-18th century, Gypsy slavery persisted for another 100 years. After a series of revolutions, the conservative boyars finally gave in, and by 1856, all Romanian Gypsies were freed. But what kind of world did they find themselves in? Well, to put it bluntly, their timing was terrible again. They missed the boat when most European nations had already formed and staked their claims to land. It was like a children's game of musical chairs running around to music, and when it stops, you have to sit down first. Many found a seat, but the Gypsies were left standing. Roca's stages of nation building simply didn't work for them. Their neighbors, Bulgarians, Romanians, Serbs, Hungarians, with their developed national movements, were so far ahead that catching up was impossible. They were already publicly demanding their own states and would eventually wrest them from European empires, some from the Austrians, others from the Ottomans. The Gypsies, meanwhile, spent this time in a state of enforced stasis. They had to start from scratch. In the 19th century, Gypsies were scattered across Europe, regardless of how the continent was divided by borders. Everywhere, they were an absolute minority. And where they were numerous enough to claim anything in Romania, they were slaves until yesterday. Any hint of Gypsy nationalism was met with mockery. Their language was often dismissed as gibberish, not a real language. Some even went so far as to deny their distinct appearance, claiming they deliberately darkened their skin. Auto-tanning as we deserved. Another critical factor was cultural conservatism. Recall Romanipe. Gypsies saw themselves as happy wanderers. Any political activity went against their philosophy. Skepticism from above and conservatism from below crushed Gypsy nationalism in a vice. Yet it managed to break through. In 1879, a conference in Hungary discussed ways to achieve Gypsy political and civil rights across the continent. The European press mocked the event, but for Gypsies, it was their first political success. In Romania, Gypsy newspapers and magazines began to appear, and the General Association of Romanian Gypsies established a national holiday to celebrate emancipation. They advocated for libraries, hospitals, and universities for Gypsies. Recall rock, forming identity through culture, is the first step in nation building. In the early 20th century, Gypsies went further. The leader of Bulgarian Gypsies submitted a petition to the local parliament, signed by all Gypsy leaders in Bulgaria, demanding equal rights. 2 years later, in the US, Gypsies from Serbia filed a request in Washington to establish a National Gypsy Association in America. In Russia, the All-Russian Gypsy Union even declared plans for a Gypsy state. This was around the time of the Zionist congresses, and many Gypsy leaders drew inspiration from the Jewish example. In the early 1930s, Bucharest hosted the World Gypsy Congress, which adopted a program to promote Gypsy self-awareness and demand minority rights. After all, Gypsies weren't even considered a minority in most places. There was no unified Gypsy ethnicity, as the peoples typically called Gypsies spoke different languages and followed different traditions. They often didn't even know of a Gypsy ethnicity, let alone a nation. They couldn't be classified as a religious minority either, since most were Christians. This caused a mental short-circuit for officials. They were citizens, but strange ones. The World Gypsy Congress was a grandiose name. Even an all-European Gypsy Union was impossible due to geopolitics. But within national borders, Gypsies managed to organize. The real celebrities of the Gypsy world were the Queek royal family in Poland. They were the loudest in calling for Gypsies to find a homeland. The Queeks understood that European Gypsies were deeply fragmented, but they had a plan. First, unity had to be achieved within each nation-state. This would drive an international national movement, a pan-European gypsiness. Then they could fight for their own land, wherever it might be. The idea wasn't illogical, but in the context of Europe, it was nothing short of utopian. By the way, about gypsy kings, barons, counts, and dukes, where did they come from? From the moment they arrived in Europe, gypsies had intermediaries who dealt with the outside world. For convenience, they translated gypsy terms into categories Europeans understood. Anyone could claim the title of king of all gypsies. In British history, there are enough such kings for 10 seasons of a gypsy Game of Thrones. Their authority was, of course, more modest than that of European dynasties. Yet, gypsy society couldn't be monarchical by definition. It contradicted Romanite and the nomadic way of life. Meanwhile, gypsy nationalists pushed a truly groundbreaking idea. We were one people when we came to Europe. We must become one people again. After all, the gypsy people somehow maintained unity on their journey from India to Europe, only to lose it in Europe. Between the world wars, the gypsy world gained a right to exist. Hungary saw thriving gypsy activism. Romania supported the international pan-gypsy movement. In pre-war Poland, things were different. There, Gypsy King Michael Queek declared he wanted to establish a state on the banks of the Ganges in India, the ancestral homeland of the Roma. The Queeks didn't stop there. They proposed allocating land for gypsies in South Africa. In 1937, they asked the Archbishop of Warsaw to recognize Janusz Queek as the king of the gypsy people. After approval, he sent invitations to European heads of state and, on July 4th of that year, was crowned Janusz I with pomp before a crowd of thousands. In his coronation speech, he suggested sending a delegate to Mussolini to secure land for gypsies in Ethiopia. He did approach the fascist government, but they had their own response ready. Even before Hitler came to power, gypsies in Germany were considered inferior social outcasts and criminals. In the 1920s, in the seemingly mild Weimar Republic, gypsies were labeled Lebenswerts Leben, lives unworthy of life, though not yet officially. But in Bavaria and Prussia, special police units monitored gypsies, photographing them and taking fingerprints for no reason other than precaution. The Weimar Constitution proclaimed civic equality, but by 1920, gypsies were banned from public parks and baths. 5 years later, unemployed gypsies were sent to labor camps for the public good. Note, this was all before Hitler. Under the Nazis, things got much worse. Gypsies fell under the Nuremberg laws on blood and honor protection, which banned sexual relations between Aryans and non-Aryans. But wait, weren't Aryans, in Nazi mythology, from India? And gypsies too? Shouldn't they have been protected? By 1936, under Robert Ritter's leadership, racial studies of gypsies began. The conclusion was grim. The gypsy question could only be resolved by permanently stopping their reproduction. The Office of Racial Hygiene declared gypsies hereditarily diseased, fit only for elimination. The systematic genocide of gypsies lasted nearly 7 years, from 1939 to 1945. The exact number of victims remains unknown, with estimates ranging from 250,000 to 1.5 million. Between a quarter and half of all European gypsies were exterminated in labor camps, urban ghettos, and death camps. The criteria for gypsiness were stricter than those for Jews. If even 2 of your 8 great-grandparents were partially gypsy, you were sent to Auschwitz. Proportionally, gypsies suffered more from Nazi atrocities than any other ethnic group. This genocide is known in gypsy history as parajmos, literally devastation or violation. The gypsy genocide during World War II was a continuous nightmare. But what's most shocking about parajmos isn't that it happened, but that it went unrecognized for so long. The Nuremberg trials didn't even mention it. No reparations were offered to gypsies. No national or international organization worked on rehabilitating survivors. Pre-war anti-gypsy laws remained in effect in West Germany until 1947. Survivors of death camps had to hide to avoid being reincarcerated in labor camps under new authorities, which continued operating after the war. Few realize this, but some anti-gypsy laws in Europe persisted into the 1950s. It later emerged that Interpol actively used gypsy dossiers compiled by the Nazis in its investigations. When questioned, Germans claimed, measures taken against gypsies during the war were legitimate state policy. Their race had nothing to do with it. They were just asocial. It doesn't qualify as genocide. Only in 1982 did West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl officially acknowledge that gypsies were victims of Nazi genocide 40 years later. But here's the most tragic part. Parajmos had no impact on the gypsies' social status. Genocides have been denied before, but never has a large-scale genocide led to such universal indifference. This apathy stems from the fact that, unlike Jews, Armenians, Tutsi, or other victims of ethnic catastrophes, gypsies don't dwell on their past. What is there to discuss? Many communities lack a stable written tradition. Memories of death camps, like all gypsy historical memory, are passed down orally in legends and family stories, but they're rarely shared with Gajo outsiders. Gypsies don't strive to study parajmos. Surprisingly, most books about their genocide were written not by gypsies, but by Jewish scholars. Parajmos is often compared to the Holocaust, but the fates of the two peoples post-genocide diverged sharply. Jews worked with the historical memory of World War II, and soon after, the State of Israel was established. For gypsies, Parajmos was purely a catastrophe, not a starting point. The genocide destroyed the political momentum that had been building before the war. Hitler eradicated the nascent gypsy intelligentsia. After the Wehrmacht invaded Poland, Janusz Quick, who hoped to secure a gypsy state from Mussolini, was offered collaboration with death squads. The Gypsy King refused and was executed alongside others. The gypsy movement effectively vanished. After the war, there simply weren't enough people capable of political organization. There was no one to demand reparations, no one to represent gypsies at Nuremberg, no one to propose parajmos as the basis for a new national identity. It seemed all was lost. The genocide neutralized the political potential of gypsy nationalism, but some things were restored. After the war, the Quick royal family tried to take the reins again. The new king, Rudolf, declared himself president of the World Gypsy Council. Things seemed to move forward, but there was no actual council. The Quicks tried to pose as international leaders of a non-existent movement, to no avail. In the 1960s, the Gypsy King died in obscurity, and his relatives moved to France. But there, unexpectedly, the gypsy movement was reborn, a truly remarkable story. In the spring of 1959, several French newspapers reported that gypsies in the Paris suburbs had elected and crowned their supreme leader, titled Voivode II. Journalists discovered his real name, Ionel Rotaru, not to be confused with Sofia Rotaro's 1972 song. Experts immediately declared the coronation fake, as French gypsies had never engaged in such practices. Officials called Rotaru an opportunist, a pathological liar, and a fantasist. Even Le Monde, one of France's two leading newspapers, covered it. Despite this seemingly trivial news, French authorities took a keen interest in Ionel. Thanks to this, we know who this self-proclaimed supreme leader was. Rotaru was born in 1918 to an ordinary family in Bessarabia. His father was an engineer, his brothers an architect and a journalist. During the war, he was in the Bucharest ghetto, and in 1947, he illegally entered France. He worked as a sailor and a miner. Naturally, the gendarmes were interested in more than just the coronation. The Cold War was in full swing, and the Soviet Union supported national liberation movements worldwide, so the gypsy rights advocate was preemptively labeled a communist spy. Spoiler, he wasn't. Rotara lived quietly in the Paris suburb of Montereau-sous-Bois, which the French called the gypsy capital of the world. In a small house on Victor Hugo Street, a sign read, Comite Mondial de Roms, World Gypsy Community. Rotaro's skillfully created organizations and associations, published bulletins, and made it clear his political ambitions were global. Branches of his gypsy community opened not only in France, but also in Poland and Yugoslavia. His pocket newspaper urged, now is the time to unite. All European gypsies should support King Vita Voivod II. Over time, the apartment on Victor Hugo Street became the headquarters of an international movement, complete with paperwork and a press attaché. From there, Rotara sent appeals to governments and the UN, and journalists came for interviews. Of course, it was a completely fictitious gypsy government, but it achieved a lot, for example, convincing the French government to fund education for gypsy children in Paris slums. Recall rock. The first stage is always culture and education. After Parajmos, everything had to start from scratch. Rotara painted bright prospects for gypsies. Those educated in France would become teachers abroad, spreading literacy through gypsy communities. He even suggested French could become a second language for gypsies worldwide. But the gypsy question was acute in France too. Police regularly raided gypsy camps, and all nomads had to carry cards detailing their height, photo, and even ear size. Entering or leaving any settlement meant searches, but Rotara knew what to do and when. He had a keen sense of the times. The World War had led to a cultural and moral crisis. Massive losses and unprecedented cruelty created a widespread demand for change. It was the 1960s, universal emancipation, the year of Africa, the summer of love. Martin Luther King had a dream, and so on. At a UN assembly, Rotara argued that gypsies saw themselves as a single people despite their scattered groups and lack of uniform customs. Ultimately, the French government was forced to humanize the gypsy question and pass several liberal laws. It's known that Rotara even visited Israel, not for Tel Aviv's beaches, but to attend the trial of Holocaust architect Adolf Eichmann. He wasn't there by chance. Rotara drew attention to the silenced gypsy genocide. In the 1960s, there was no data or even a rough understanding that the Nazi regime had killed hundreds of thousands of gypsies. Rotara was among the first to collect documents, aiming to prove to the world that gypsies were still here and were a people. But it took nearly 20 more years for progress. Rotara was a talented politician, but his project's main weakness was obvious. Then, and clearly now, gypsies had no national territory, a place on the map to claim. Rotara approached this creatively. First, he coined a name for such a state, Romanistan, literally gypsy land. Second, Romanistan's location kept changing. He spoke of Somalia, then some uninhabited spot in the Indian Ocean, then an estate owned by his allies in Lion. In one interview, Rotara asked a Dutch journalist if the Netherlands had any islands for sale. It seemed like pure delusion, but that was the genius of his project. Rotara knew a gypsy state was unrealizable. He didn't aim to create a physical Romanistan for a nomadic people. Attachment to territory was unnecessary and likely impossible. Remember the Sami? Rotara believed an international network of headquarters under UN protection would at least safeguard gypsies from repression. Education and culture would unite communities, and a nation without territory, always a problem, would become a defining feature. Not a bug, but a feature. But it ended prosaically, as always. His romanticism about a borderless world clashed with Charles de Gaulle's police state. The French president was aligning with West Germany, and Rotara, constantly raising the gypsy genocide, was out of place. In 1965, the French government banned all his organizations, citing that they were led by a foreigner, a stateless person. King Vita Voivod and his entourage moved to the eternal refuge of political émigrés, Switzerland, and continued working. 6 years later, police in French Brittany detained 2 Polish gypsy women. Their passports, though very official-looking, were issued by the World Gypsy Community, signed by its supreme leader. The passport case quickly escalated into an international scandal. Rotaro was arrested and convicted. Even the Catholic Church turned against him. A prominent abbot declared Rotaro a fraud, a self-proclaimed impostor, and not even a gypsy. After 1971, Rotaro largely disappeared from the press. Even in the gypsy movement, few traces of him remain today. Romanistan went down in history as the adventure of an extravagant dreamer. Yet everything else, from demands for reparations and passports to the right to education, became the foundation of the modern gypsy political movement. In 1978, the International Romani Union picked up the initiative. It remains the largest transnational organization, with offices in Vienna, Skopje, and Washington. In 1979, the Union gained observer status at the UN. The gypsy political movement now has a flag, an anthem, and even a semi-standardized language. April 8th is the official International Romani Day. Recently, the Union's president, another self-proclaimed king of all gypsies, announced plans to raise the question of a gypsy state at the UN, though, as always, without specific territorial demands. Meanwhile, the issues raised by gypsy nationalists in the 19th century remain unresolved. Gypsies are still Europe's most marginalized group. Few escape the social ghetto. Most live in extreme poverty, and anti-gypsy sentiment, according to all surveys, is the most widespread phobia wherever gypsies are numerous. So, there are too many reasons why a gypsy state never emerged: their unique philosophy, their reluctance to assimilate, centuries of discrimination, fragmented communities, and the horrific 20th century genocide. In the end, all their national projects failed spectacularly. A gypsy state seems like a fairy tale, happy for some, less so for others, but unrealizable for all. Let's return one last time to King Vita Voivod II. Most of his critics said his Romanistan was a fantasy incompatible with reality. They were right. Romanistan was indeed a fantasy. But it's worth remembering that, as political scientist Benedict Anderson said, nations are imagined communities. Like much in our lives, a nation exists only because people believe in it. The failed gypsy national project contains no more fantasy than, say, the successful French one, which also began with a handful of enthusiastic intellectuals in the 16th century. If you enjoyed watching our video, give it a like and be sure to subscribe to the channel. A new video is coming soon. Until then.